Thanks so much. Ariel says that so casually. He realized how important cooperation was. He didn't just realize it. When I was a grad student, I met a very esteemed scholar named Professor Ariel Dinar, and he called me up when I was a grad student, actually, at Wisconsin. Called me up and said, "Oh, I've heard you're interested. We're interested in the same kind of area. Why don't you send me some of your work, and we'll see, maybe we can work together. I'll send you some of mine." So he sends me his work, and I start to look through. I knew his name, of course. Anybody in water knows his name. But I'm reading his papers, and I have to say, I can only admit this now after 30 years, I didn't understand a thing. Not a thing. It's all equations, partial derivatives. I'm looking at this, I'm like, what do I do? He's going to call me next week. And I don't know how to admit to this esteemed scholar that I don't understand anything he does. So I'm bracing myself. The call comes. He says, "Aaron, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't understand your work. It's all words. It's all stories. Where's the analysis? Where's the?" And so from that, a wonderful relationship was formed. We've been working together ever since. I still am not quite sure the meaning of some of the papers we did together. But this idea of bringing together really, really technical and less technical is something that our relationship, I think, epitomizes, and I think is deeply necessary in the world of water. And that's what I'm going to touch on. For the last 20 years, I've always started with the same 5 slides, and unfortunately, I'll start with them again, just to give a sense of what the world of water conflict and cooperation looked like when we first met back in, and then we'll go into other important things that we've been doing. For one, what do we use water for? You guys didn't know this was going to be interactive. It's like, dude, it's finals week. Just talk. What do we use water for? Survival. Absolutely everything. What else? Specifically? Transportation. Washing, hand washing. Agriculture, all of these different uses. And the way we're presented, how many people are in water management? How many people are on the technical side, kind of engineering, hydrology? How many people are on the social, yeah, of course. How many people are on the social side? A couple of people. How many people are not in this world at all and just walked into the wrong room by accident? Oh, yeah, nice, good. The provost, excellent. So the point is, all of these uses we use, and the way it's couched, there's not enough for everybody, and that's why we have a field called water management. If there was enough for everybody, we wouldn't have to manage it. All of these uses are potentially in conflict with each other, and those people, how many have been in a room with angry stakeholders around water? Okay, really? What do the rest of you do? Happy stakeholders? Okay. Yeah, so when you're in a room, it feels like it's a zero-sum game. And that's the way it's presented to us. Agriculture versus the environment, upstream countries versus downstream countries. And the crux of the problem, to me, is embedded in these 2 maps. This is the way water people see the world. Everything's connected to everything else. All we see are the watershed boundaries. Groundwater, surface water, all the people within this unit are all connected. In contrast, what people do is they draw these nice straight lines in the middle of our watershed. Which of these is right? Which of these is the correct way to see the world? Both. Right? You can't ignore California from Oregon, right? You can't ignore United States from Canada. All of these lines are there for very legitimate reasons. So our world in shared waters is represented by needing to manage the world as if it looked this way, recognizing the very legitimate reasons for the lines on the map. When I first started getting involved in water, people were holding up these 6 case studies. And they noticed, looking around, suddenly, at the end of the Cold War, that people who don't like each other very much also share watersheds. And so people were holding up the Jordan Basin, Arabs and Israelis. How good are relations? Good answer. In Central Asia, the six countries, upstream countries are building dams. Downstream countries don't like the dams. India and Pakistan, how good are relations? Another right? the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Nile Basin. And people were holding these up and saying, look, people share water, they hate each other, it's used for everything, and therefore, and this was the dominant paradigm for about 10 years, fierce competition for fresh water may well become a source of conflict and wars in the future. How many people believe this? It's a compelling argument. We need it, we hate each other, we're running out, we're going to go to war, right? So what happened was, because initially my training is in science, my master's degree focuses on hydrogeology, and so the scientist in me looks at this and says, how do you know? On what evidence? What are the assumptions? What data is out there? This is a huge projection about really big policy implications, and the data was only 6 data points, right? And at the time, my Ph.D. dissertation was on the Jordan Basin, and in the Jordan, what you do when you really dig is you find a whole rich history of cooperation along with the tensions. Years and years, decades of people who don't like each other having sometimes implicit agreements, sometimes explicit agreements, sometimes agreeing in water when they won't agree on anything else. So what we started to do was do what scientists do. We collect stuff. And so we made the first map of all the world's transboundary basins, and it turns out that N is way bigger than 6. N is 310. Half the land surface of the Earth, about half of the world's population lives within basins that are shared by 2 or more countries. And we also looked at interactions. People had been focusing on a conflict side, but there's a whole spectrum of things that people can do besides conflict. They may conflict, or they may cooperate, or they may do nothing. But except for those 6 case studies, we didn't know anything at all about any of the other basins, not to mention the 600-some transboundary aquifers in the world. So there's a big paucity of actual information. And so once we pulled it together in what's now known as the Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database, we collected over years, we collected data about as many of these basins as we could possibly find. And one of the things, and this is why I always start here in the same place, one of the things we did was look over the last 60 years and collect every interaction between 2 states over water and put it along that spectrum. What was the issue? Who were the parties? What happened as a consequence? And this graph is probably the one that has been most reproduced and cited. And again, I think it tells a compelling story. This is the spectrum from cooperation to conflict. We collected 1,800 events over 60 years. And what you notice right off the bat is that 60% of them, 2/3 of the time we do anything over water, it's cooperate. And it's exactly the same countries that people were saying we're going to go to war. It's Arabs and Israelis. It's Indians and Pakistanis. It's Azeris and Armenians. People who don't like each other and people who like each other. United States and Canada, rich history of cooperation around water resources. On the conflict side, 80% of conflict is verbal conflict. This is either somebody writing about it or somebody talking about it. Which sectors of society play up conflict? The media, absolutely. This is the media writing about it. I know Ariel's had this experience. I've had this experience. Spend hours with a journalist talking about all this cooperation and the history and all the people who have come to the table, and the headlines the next day inevitably is what? Water wars on the horizon, right? So the media is really interested in this story of water wars. And who's the other party who likes to talk about conflict? The international agencies, because that's where their money comes. I'm talking about somebody a little higher profile. Politicians, thank you very much, right? So this is politicians are saying, we will go to war to defend the lifeblood of our nation. Who are they talking to usually? Are they talking to the neighbors? No, they're talking to their own constituents, right? Do they mean let's go to war? No, they mean vote for me in November. So our history of conflict is a rich history of politicians talking about it and journalists writing about it, and almost no actual violence at all. So these 38 cases of small-scale violence, 27 of these are between Arabs and Israelis. And what's interesting about that is the last shot fired in the Jordan Basin, specifically over water, across an international boundary, was in 1970. So think about the Arab-Israeli conflict and things that have happened since 1970. million Russian immigrants, a million other immigrants into Jordan. Intifadas, even wars have broken out, and no violence over water. In fact, if you look historically for wars over water, you have to go back 4,500 years ago to find the only documented war between two countries over water. City-states of Lagash and Umma went to war in 2500 BCE, and that's the last documented water war in history. That's interesting. That, to me, is a compelling story and gives us a direction to start to move. So since this time, a couple of things happened. I went back for more training, not on the science side, but on the conflict resolution, on the policy side. And this whole world, the world of transboundary water started to shift, started to incorporate the possibility of what's now called environmental peace building. So let's say that we know that water brings tension. I'm from Northern California, and when I was growing up, this was enemy territory, right? You guys have been stealing our water forever, right? No offense. But we know that it brings tension. We know that water brings tension, and the very tensions that it brings people in the room to problem solve, brings focus on the issue, brings attention to the place where either technical or policy solutions are implemented. So this now is a much more nuanced story, and Kofi Annan came around a couple of years later. The water problems of our world need not be a cause of tension. They can also be a catalyst for cooperation. If we work together, a secure and sustainable future can be ours. Now, this has been driving the direction of a lot of my work. We know that it brings tension, and we know the tension brings people in the room. And what do you do with them when they're in the room? So that's where I went back, and this is now about half of my job. I work as a facilitator or a mediator in rooms full of angry people who are really concerned. Upstream countries are building dams, and we're concerned about the dams. We jointly share a river or a lake, and we're jointly concerned about what's going to happen. Well, what do? Most of the people who are trained, who are in the room, are technical people, right? These are people who are hydrologists, who are engineers. And the interesting thing about the technical approach always is, thank you. Let me just grab that back and notice that. The interesting thing about the technical approach is you think your job is to bring answers to people, right? You think it's about the results, right? Sorry to just take that. May I borrow your phone for a second? Thank you. Can I borrow your phone for a second? Yeah, thank you so much. So I took the phone two ways. Which way felt better? The second. The second way. Why? Right? We agree? Okay. If we had only modeled this interaction, both ways of me getting the phone would have been the same. Right? X equals 0, they have the phone. X equals 1, I have the phone. The only difference is the process. And so this is one of the things that you learn really, really quickly when you're in a room full of angry people. It's all about the process. A lot of us have been in rooms, and you walk in. I worked for, I won't say which, a federal agency that surveys geology. Let's just put it like that. And I would walk in rooms full of angry people, and I'd say, guys, you don't have to be angry anymore. I have the solution, right? Here it is. And they go, oh, that's such nonsense. And they just get angrier because I was trying to impose the solution from outside. And then we'd spend years trying to work out what the solution is, and they'd come back to exactly what was proposed years earlier, but it was then their solution. The only difference was the process, right? So trying to understand, this was something I was deeply untrained in as a hydrogeologist. And so I went back, as I said, for training in conflict resolution. And this was kind of the primer, the classic primer in what we call alternative dispute resolution, right? How many people have heard of this book, Get Into Yes? Okay. If you're into ADR at all, this is a good place to start and look at this from a scientific perspective, from a rationalist perspective. This is great. This is so rational. Separate the people from the problem. Problem's not the people. Just separate them and focus on the problem. Focus on interests, not positions. Invent options for mutual gain. Insist on objective criteria. You can model the solution and model what the allocation should be, and it's a deeply rational approach. So this appealed to me, and it was deeply unsatisfying. When you get into a room, how many people have been involved in conflict resolution? How many people have been in a relationship? Okay, so you all have, right? Think of the last conflict that you have. Was it rational? You're going, yeah, my side was rational, right? Yeah. The trick is, in the room itself, the process isn't always what we call rational. It isn't something that can be optimized. What I started to notice instead is there would be moments, inflection points in a conversation where suddenly people are getting something in a profoundly different way. And when that happens, you feel it like a tangible ripple in the room, right? How many people have been in a room like that where suddenly what happened? Can you say a little bit?
Different sides just realized that ultimately they had similar values attached to their goals, and they were empathetic with each other.
They were empathetic, right? And nowhere in alternative dispute resolution is that characteristic of empathy talked about. And it's so important, right? So that's what would happen. Somebody would say something nice about somebody else, or somebody would listen to somebody else, and suddenly there was a ripple in the room. And so you started to notice, as I did, and again, with the scientist's mind, I'm saying, whoa, there are these transformative moments, and you never hear about them in the literature at all. It's just not there. Well, we see them all the time in our lives, right? God forbid somebody gets sick and their lives transformed, right? I'm going to spend more time with my kids. I'm going to watch my diet a little more carefully. How many parents do we have in the room? Okay, your life changed a little bit when your kids came along? That's a transformative moment, right? It's like, I don't care about your degrees, your accomplishments. Feed me. Change me. Right? Sudden transformation. And it's not here. It's not here. So you notice it. And one of the things that I noticed is this would come up a lot when I would show these two maps, right? Whatever basin I'm working in, at some point I would show them their own basin without the borders on the map. And that's one of those moments where you would see suddenly people are like really disoriented, right? Where'd that come from? Oh. And immediately you start to look for yourself, right? Where am I? And then the next step is, oh my gosh, we're all connected, right? This is one of those moments when I would show people their basin without the boundaries. That was one of those transformative moments. And so I would use it a lot in facilitations. I'd use it a lot in trainings. And I worked for a while with a colleague of both Ariel's and mine at the World Bank, a guy named Vahida Lavian. And we were talking about these images. I said, what is it about this that's so transformative? Why are these two images so powerful? And he said something that changed the course, the direction, both of my professional and personal life. He said, isn't this really an analog for spiritual transformation? Isn't this what faith traditions try and get you to do? You're in your boundaries, you're focused on your own needs, your own desires, and isn't their goal often to get you to see the world without boundaries, to see the connections to each other, or if it's in your language, to see the connections to the divine, right? Now, Ariel kindly introduced me. I'm at a land grant, sea grant, space grant, sun grant school. I'm in the College of Earth, Ocean, Atmospheric Sciences. I'm trained as a scientist. He said that, and I had two reactions almost instantaneously. The one was, don't talk to me about that. That's not my purview. I'm at a land grant, sea grant, space grant, sun. We don't talk about spirituality. Right now, I can see a lot of your body language like, ooh, where's this going? What's he going to try and sell me, right? And that was my experience with that word. It's like, oh, we don't talk about it in public, right? I'll talk in a bit about the reason we don't talk about it and why it's so disconcerting, especially for those of us in the West. The second reaction I had after all little red flags went up and said, ooh, can't do this, was as a scientist, I started to think about what he said. And here was his exact suggestion. Why don't you go out to faith traditions and find out how they construct the things that we deal with, anger, conflict, and what are the tools they use to help provide a setting that's conducive to these transformative moments. And so the scientist in me went, whoa, that actually makes a certain amount of sense. So as a rational utilitarian scientist, I went out and played for years. So I had two things that made this possible. One, I had a sabbatical coming up that allowed me to go out and actually spend a good bit of time in different communities to try and understand from their perspectives what did conflict look like, what did anger look like, what did transformation look like. And two, I had tenure, so I couldn't get fired for doing the research. So God bless both of those institutions. And the first thing I did, I worked with a guy, some of you know Peter Glick. He's up in the Bay Area. He has an institute, the Pacific Institute. So the first thing we did, and this is now 8 years ago, we had a meeting between people who had negotiated water at a really high level and leaders from different faith traditions. And we tried to have a conversation about what we could learn from each other. It was in Vatican City. It was co-sponsored by the Vatican Science Council. How many people knew the Vatican had a science council? Really? I didn't. I thought, wait, isn't that a contradiction in terms? This is like, wait, what about Galileo, right? Well, it turns out, since Galileo, the Catholic Church has said, we have a strained relationship with science. We need to keep an eye on science. And if scientific consensus conflicts with church teaching, we have to change our teaching. And it's the Vatican Science Council that keeps an eye on science. So we all get together in Vatican City. And it's an absolutely amazing meeting. How many people have been to Vatican City? A couple of people. Did you go behind the Swiss Guards at Vatican City? No, because you weren't invited by the Vatican Science Council. So if you've been to Vatican City, it's crazy, huge numbers of people in the chapel and all the Sistine Chapel, and everything's going on. But if you're invited by them, you flash the key to the hostel, and you walk by, and the Swiss Guards have got this, I don't know what it's called, halyard, like part axe and part spear, right? You've seen these guys, right? Dressed in Renaissance uniforms, and they pull their swords back and they salute you. It's such a rush, right? So we're back here in the quiet side of Vatican City, and we have this meeting, and it's absolute disaster, right? We only had 3 days, and you can imagine how different our languages are, right? We have the water minister from Nepal. He's talking about fluvial, hydro, geo, something or other. And next to him, there's this Sufi mystic who didn't say a word for 3 days, but he glowed with such positive energy. You notice people trying to sit next to him just to get some of the energy on him, right? So you can't, our languages are so different. What came out of it, instead of any kind of awareness, was the questions. And these are the questions that then preoccupied me for the following 8 years. How do faith traditions understand conflict and anger? What are the tools that we can use from their world in our world of water conflict? So the rest, I want to talk just about a couple of the lessons. The first, how many people really enjoy having difficult conversations? Really? What kind of administrator is he? Is he a good administrator? Yeah, okay, just checking. How many people really dislike having difficult conversations? Yeah, most of us. Okay, so what I'm asking you to do is picture the last really difficult conversation you had, okay? And picture somebody talking to you, the initial moments when somebody's saying something that you deeply, profoundly disagree with, okay? What's the very first thing that happens? Say again? You shut down. Say again? You become defensive. What's happening in your body? Stress. How do you know you're stressed?
You feel like either like a slight headache, or you feel like your muscles tensing up, or
Muscles tensing up, adrenaline's running through your body.
Your eyebrows might shoot up, you might roll your eyes in contempt.
Posture. Right? Yeah, right? So all of these, especially the physical reaction, is called the amygdala capture, right? We call it fight or flight, but it's basically your amygdala is always scanning what's going on around you, right? It sits here at the base of your spine. And whenever it feels it's in danger, it captures everything else. And it takes over all of your systems. So your muscles tense up, your eyes dilate, the pores open up. You have a tangible physical response. So think about what's going on. Even if we did a simulation here in this room and we just simulated a difficult conversation, you'd have the same reaction. So here we'd be sitting in beautiful Riverside, California. It's a gorgeous day. I guess it's always a gorgeous day in Riverside, California. You'd be in a simulated, you know the person who's speaking to you doesn't believe what they say. You know rationally you're in a simulation, and your body would still think somebody's trying to kill you. Right? That's what's happening when you're having difficult conversations. Your amygdala says somebody's trying to kill you. So when somebody says, oh, just calm down, why are you tensing up? It's like, no, somebody's trying to kill me. Well, no, they just disagree with your politics. But it feels like that in your body, right? Then what starts to happen? We said you shut down. What starts to happen emotionally? Anybody get angry? Right? Anybody get frustrated? Anybody get agitated? Right? I got to say, I take a class, there's some really neat geology that's right around an open pit on public land that people use for shooting. And so anytime I take my class out there are always people out there with like whole arsenals of like serious weaponry. And I was just out, and this guy had brought his television, his computer, almost any electronic he had, a couple of phones, and he was just blowing the crap out of them, right? This is the frustration that we sometimes feel at whatever's going on, right? So you have this emotional response, and then what? Anybody been in a difficult conversation or heard somebody, a commentator that they disagreed with, who made a good point? Right? It's kind of frustrating, right? So, ooh, that's a good point. Right? So you might have an intellectual response, and maybe at that point, once you've gone through the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, when you're up here in your head, maybe it hurts just a little bit less. Your amygdala is kind of calming down, and it's going, okay, this ain't so bad. Let's check out what's going on, right? And then the next level, anybody ever been in a tough conversation and find themselves really connecting with the other person? Kind of gratified that you walked away going, oh, wow, we do connect. Right? A couple of people. Okay, so notice these reactions, the physical, the emotional, the intellectual or perceptual, and then the spiritual, right? The levels that we have. Whoa, Now I know I'm in Southern California. Beads instead of water. I love that. All right. So the first lesson that came out of this was understanding how universal those four worlds are, the physical, emotional. And so here we are, and you see it everywhere, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and each of these are tied to a position, to a strategy for negotiations, right? Positions, interests, values, and harmony. We'll talk more about these. Anybody recognize these? Say again? Health aspects, okay. And? Thank you, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So Maslow, 1950s, psychologist, he says, oh, we have all these needs and they happen in a hierarchy, right? You have your physical needs, you have to make sure your physical needs are met first, and then you move up, and only at the end do you ask yourself what it all means, right? How many people have seen this before or heard of it? Abraham Maslow, 1950s. Do you know it's been updated for the 21st century, right? We have a new bottom line. It's actually older, much, much older than Abraham Maslow. So I know it in my tradition, when Moses went up Mount Sinai, these are the four levels of holiness that he went up in the Jewish tradition. So at the base of the mountain, there's physical holiness. Then only he and 70 of the leaders go up part way. It's a Jewish event, so what do? Have a meal on the side of the mountain. Then only Moses himself goes onward. The third level and the fourth level is the cloud itself, right? So you have these four levels, and then when the temple was built in Jerusalem, it was built as a guided meditation from the outward into the inner, the Holy of Holies, precisely along these four levels. When the temple was destroyed, it was taken, the meditation was taken and put into the Jewish prayer service. So Jews who pray 3 times a day, they pray specifically at each of these levels in order. So you start, you've seen people put the phylacteries on their head, on their arm, and they're grateful for the physical components, then some psalms to elicit positive emotion, and then the Shema, the unity of God is realized, and then the 4th level, spiritual level, is the Amidah, or the silent prayer, right? Anybody know what tradition Abraham Maslow came from? He was Jewish, so this is not Maslow's hierarchy, this is God's hierarchy of needs. He ripped the whole thing, just ripped it right off from God. Never a citation or reference. But it's elsewhere if you start to look. Look at Vishnu's 4 totems, right? The mace, symbol of physical strength, the lotus flower, the glory of existence. The discus is up here, the mind chakra. And then the conch, when you make that sound, that primeval om, and even the om itself, it starts low and comes out, and they say that the work happens in the silence after the M, right? So it's Om and then silence, right? We see it in, how many people have been to Angkor Wat? No? So Angkor Wat was initially a Hindu shrine, now it's Buddhist. Also, from the outer to the inner up, and the artwork itself references each of these 4 levels. In Buddhism, the Buddha started his path after 4 sites, 1 recognizing physical impermanence, 1 suffering and disconnection. I saw a dead person representing the tenuous link between being and non-being, and finally the spiritual, the ascetic he saw on his path. And according to some traditions, when the Buddha was meditating the night he was enlightened, he followed again a specific meditation through each of these 4 levels called Anapanasati Sutra. Christianity, if you go to the churches all through all through Europe, you see the 4 elements. Each of the elements is guarded by an archangel. And of course, at that time, archangels were all what? What do you see common with these guys? Yeah, they're all white men, right? So we decided, again, updated for the 21st century, thanks to Disney. In native tradition, certainly in the western U.S., all the way down into Latin America, you'll find some version of a medicine wheel. The same thing, representing each of the four worlds in a cycle, right? This happens to be Shoshone Bannock and Ogallala Lakota, gifted to me by a guy named Sammy Matza. In both Islam and in Latin American traditions, there are a couple of things besides the 4 that seem to be universal. There's some attributes to them. One, as you get deeper into them, the differences between us start to dissipate, right? So if you notice, in Sharia, this is what they say is Sharia legislates what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. In Tariqah, prayer of the heart, what's yours is mine, what's mine is yours. In Hakika, at this level, there is no mine and there is no yours. And then at Marifah, this level of attunement, there is no me, there is no you, right? So we get closer and closer, and you recognize that you can't hurt somebody else without hurting yourself, that at some level we're all profoundly connected. The other thing in the icons used in Latin American world is where the energy is. So serpent is down low, the jaguar is here, hummingbird is here, and eagle is up in here. So if we talk about energy centers at different levels of our being, what are we talking about? The chakras, exactly right. So this is the work of the energy within us, and again, you find this fairly universal. All right, let's get back to water. Remember water? So how do you use this in a water negotiation? It's really interesting that there seem to be some points that you can tap on that have universal components to them. One, if you get stuck on a problem, make it bigger or higher, right? So you elevate a conversation. If you look at right now in most of the tough conversations we have, say guns, for example, at the level of positions, I'm pro-gun, I'm anti-gun, right? But if you raise to the level that we start to reach a place where we're concerned about the same thing, what are we all concerned about? Safety. Safety. I feel unsafe and therefore I want more guns around me. I feel unsafe and therefore I want fewer guns around me. So learning to start the conversation at the mutual concern of safety and then backing into where we have differences. And you can do this with any divisive issue that we have. At some point you reach a level that we do have common values, and starting there and moving backwards is one of the things that we learn. So for example, we'll go to the Middle East. There's a little area of land right here where Syria, Jordan, and Israel all come together. And I want to say this diplomatically. In the years that Israel had this territory, the border, let's just say, drifted. Not going to say why it drifted, but the border just drifted from Israeli territory into Jordanian territory. And so when they sat down to negotiate peace between Jordan and Israel, there was this strip of land that was recognized as being Jordanian, and Jordan wanted it back. Right? And everybody said, oh, it's intractable, intractable. Israel had been farming this area for decades. And so now if we raise the level, what actually does each side want? They both want the territory, but why? What does Jordan want? Exactly. They're interested in an acknowledgement of their sovereignty. What does Israel want? They want to keep farming. Right? It's not ownership of the land. They want to keep farming. So once you look at this level of values, can you now reconcile? It's not two people wanting the same land. It's two people wanting different aspects of the same land. So can you reconcile that? Yes, absolutely. Sovereignty went back to Jordan. You can barely see there's a little Jordanian flag flying over the territory. So Jordan got sovereignty back, recognizing, yes, this is ours, and then leased it to Israel for 25 years, right? And so now, this is now 25 years, and now they're looking at it again to see if they're going to do it for another 25 years. But even if not, it's not as tense as it was 25 years ago. So even if Israel now turns it back, it wouldn't be as tense. Elevating the conversation and recognizing that water has a spiritual component is deeply difficult for Westerners. If we started this meeting with a prayer, how many people would feel really uncomfortable? Y'all would. Even the ones that are not raising your hand, y'all would, right? How about if we started with a host of prayers? If you had a rabbi, an imam, and a priest all offering their prayers, would you feel a little less uncomfortable? Absolutely. And this is what happens in a lot of places, especially when we're talking about water, is that if you have a number of people elevating the conversation and recognizing that water is not just a technical resource, helps to start the conversation off at that level, which can then have profound. Here in the West, how many people have been in a room where on native land where the tribes started with indigenous prayers? Do you feel uncomfortable at all about it? Absolutely not. It's a totally different setting. So recognizing the spiritual component of water is a deeply useful way to start, and even alluding to water's place in different traditions. It turned out that the Buddha actually mediated a water dispute at some point. He went to the princes. He said, why are the people about to fight? They said, we don't know. He went to the vice princes. Why are they about to fight? We don't know. He went to the people. He said, why are you guys going to fight? They said, well, it's because of the water. He said, well, went back to the princes and said, is the blood you're about to spill worth more than the water you're fighting over? It stopped it on the spot. Tapping into the faith communities to help us raise the value, raise the conversation, or even act as mediators. There are a lot of places where the church or one of the churches or a faith body actually has much more credibility than anybody else who's leading these conversations. Right now, we're renegotiating an old treaty with Canada on the Columbia Basin. I say every map is tied to a worldview. So this is my worldview. Notice the only attributes labeled on the map? Universities, right? So this is the way I kind of see the world. It's like, well, there's the university and everything else. Well, how many riparians are there in the Columbia Basin? Really? It's just north of you guys. Where's our geographer? Oh, right, you don't have a geography program. Ouch. How many riparian sovereign riparians are there within the Columbia Basin? It's there on the map. 2, you're supposed to answer in unison. 2, US and Canada. Well, you'd be wrong, which is why you didn't answer, I'm sure, because when it's those 2, and again, let me just divert for a second why I think it's so hard to have these conversations. About 200 years ago in the West, what we call the Enlightenment, we decided for very specific, mostly political reasons, but also religious reasons, to separate out the worlds of rationality and spirituality, right? And we said, we're going to, in public discourse, we're only going to talk about things you can measure. And you can measure anything. You can measure intelligence, you can measure affection, you can measure, and as long as you can measure it, you can talk about it in the public sphere. You can have this other life, this spiritual life, but it's private. You do it in your home, you do it in your Friday community, your Saturday community, your Sunday community. Just don't bring it into public sphere, right? And so we've been doing that more. We've forgotten now. It's only been 200 years. And so we've forgotten it's a very recent amount of time that we've been doing this, and in very specific geographic locations. Rest of the world didn't do this. So for them, it's like us before all of this, where it's all part of one. The physical, the emotional, the intellectual, and spiritual are all part of one component, right? You don't separate. You can't possibly separate them out. So what we did basically is we decided to look through the world with one eye closed, and then we've been doing it for 200 years, and we think this is the way the world looks. And then we go out to the rest of the world, and we go, hey, guys, this is really cool. You should do this too. Why don't you close one eye? And so as we carry out, and because of power differential, as we carry out our global conversations, this worldview becomes more and more dominant, subsuming a lot of the things that are important for the rest of the world, and if we're honest, for us as well. But we don't know how to talk about it. So when the US and Canada talks about water, they talk about maximizing benefits. What are benefits? Things that you can quantify, things that you can put a dollar value on, right? So both the US, this was the US position, talked about maximizing benefits. The Canadian position talked about maximizing benefits. Now, how many riparians are there in the Columbia Basin? Many more than 2. There's 15 sovereign tribes in the basin on the US side, right? Each one of these has legal sovereignty. This is a country unto its own. And in each of these countries, this is the worldview. Don't talk to us about the value of salmon in a dollar sense. Bring it back. Bring it back. Our spirituality relies on the annual return of the salmon runs. Our entire set of relations, our emotional world, relies on the relations that the salmon run brings. Don't put a dollar value. And in Canada, where the First Nations don't have the same legal standing as in the US, they're saying the same thing. There's 2 big dams blocking salmon from Canada, and they're saying, we don't care. Bring the salmon back to Canada. And now, because we're renegotiating, now we're able to start having the conversation in a way that we wouldn't years ago. When we're going out into the communities to have the conversation about water, oftentimes these are our allies, and this is the guy that we send, right? If you're going out into the world, let's remember that not everybody is looking through the world with one eye shut. Let's listen to the values. And a lot of times, I've been in those rooms where we're saying this and this and this are your metrics for success. And the response often is, what about our relations? What about honor? What about faith? What about all the things that are important to us that you're not capturing in your equations? The other useful thing that's in the faith tradition is a very deep practice of listening, recognizing that conflict is within. We are really bad listeners, and there's a joke that's told about Americans. For an American, what's the opposite of speaking? Waiting to speak. Right? And you all know what I'm talking about, right? We're really bad at listening. Well, here, this is the Kabbalistic, the tree of life, also with the 4 worlds, but divided up into different attributes. And I want to focus on these 3. In this model, the source of anger is too much justice, too much self. This is set up as a balance between self and other, in balance with compassion, right? So the idea is that you need to be healthy yourself, and you need to be able to listen and recognize the needs of the other person. And together, this is in some kind of balance. And the source of anger is too much justice, too many boundaries, too much focus inward. And if you think about it, that's where it comes from. You think about the last tough conversation you had. You walked away, you said, I'm right. And then you said, I'm righteous. And then you start to spin yourself up and you go, I'm self-righteous. And at some point you get so self-righteous that you can hurt somebody else, right? But that's an inward story. And the only way to evoke that inward story, recognizing that that anger then is a shield of vulnerability, the only way to hear the vulnerability is to learn to listen. So we train in a lot of different places. We train this idea of active listening. How many people have heard this term, active listening? A lot of people. For 99% of interactions, it's great. You engage, you ask questions. And for real trauma, it's absolutely useless. Why? It introduces the listener. And there is a level of listening that, again, is found mostly in faith communities where you're solely there for the speaker. You're there simply as a presence. You're there to hear everything that the speaker wants to engage with you about, right? You don't, somebody comes and says, oh, my grandmother died this weekend. You don't say, oh, wow, I saw a sale on caskets down the street. Why don't we go? You don't come up with advice, right? They're not looking for you. They're looking for your presence for them. And that level of listening is something, again, that you find in mostly in faith traditions. It's about presence. This is what they call listening from the heart. And this also is a kind of listening that you can learn, but you have to be conscious of it. You have to be cognizant of it. You find in the water world, this was very useful. I was mediating between 4 countries in the lower Mekong. What are the 4 countries, quickly? No geographers in the room. Okay, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, right? 4 lower countries. And in this room, 3 countries, no matter what we were talking about, 3 countries said yes, 1 country said no, right? So should we use this monitoring mechanism? 3 countries said yes, 1 country said no. Shall we use this method of evaluation? 3 countries said yes, 1 country said no. Should we go to lunch at 11:30? 3 countries said yes, 1 country said no. So what do you know about when one of the parties is constantly saying no? What do you know? What did we just say? Anger is a shield protecting vulnerability, right? You know it's probably the weakest country. And you know there's some vulnerability that you're not catching as a facilitator. So what do? Do we turn to the party and say, what are you vulnerable about? No. Take a break, go for a walk, what's going on, and what's the conversation like? Those people are trying to do this, and those people are trying to do this. Oh, they're trying to take advantage, and if you listen and listen and listen, you get to this place. The other party at some point will do that. I'm not sure our technicians are up to standards with their technicians. I'm not sure our people are good enough. And in this part of the world, what's a really important thing in communities? Honor, face, right? So, oh, okay, what do we do? Do we go back in the room and we say, oh, they can't do it? No, absolutely not. What do? So I took it on myself. I said, we've been doing this wrong. We've been talking about where we want to be 5 or 10 years from now. Let's remember that we all need to start at ground zero. Let's all develop a common method of evaluating these impacts. We'll build up together. We'll develop a Mekong way of doing this. And then what does she pipe up and say? Yes, absolutely, and the first meeting can be in our country, right? So this level of listening, which is not something that's taught in Getting to Yes, is a profoundly useful thing in any mediation and also in most relations. This idea of silence and listening to is so valued in faith traditions. I love this one quote. Being listened to is so close to being loved, most people can't tell the difference, right? So if you get nothing out of this hour except for that, and you go home and you're triggered, and you remember to listen instead of defend yourself, see if that doesn't change the whole tenor of conversation. I'll give you one word of warning, though. You got to do it from the heart, right? So my lovely wife, whom Ariel knows, and with whom I've been married for 20 plus years, 27 years, 27 years. Every now and again, we still trigger each other, and I'm trained. I mean, I got these skills down. And so I open up and I sit down. There's a way you sit, and there's a way you breathe, and there's a way you listen. And she'll look at me and she'll say, don't mediate me. Don't mediate me. Got to do it from the heart. All right. This, I'm going to skip this section in the interest of time. But the idea is, again, this idea of a balance between self and other is a wonderful model for designing facilitation, designing process. So a lot of you are really uncomfortable with all this spiritual stuff. This is also, I'll give you a graph so that you can walk out of here feeling better. This was also what John Nash said, right? His famous contribution to economics, the Nash Equilibrium. Somewhere between the needs of the individual and the needs of the group sits the Nash Equilibrium. And that's what all of our faith traditions also tell us in a lot of very profound ways, is that there is a wonderful balance between self and other that can be represented or honored in process. So you find these processes all over the world, group processes. For example, in the Mideast, you find a sulha, a ceremony of forgiveness, where this is the driving value. Taradin, resolution of a conflict that involves no humiliation, right? So it's not one side's right or one side's wrong. It's how do you find a place for justice to be served, but also mercy in the same conversation, right? People are rediscovering even places that have lost these traditions. In Singapore, for example, they're rediscovering their ability to do this. I'm going to end here. How do you do this in the modern, Western, post-Enlightenment world? This is the 2014 New Zealand water law. It was heavily influenced by the Maori community, deeply involved in crafting this. And so this comes right out of their 2014 law. All things in the natural world have a life force and a spiritual dimension. Respect for the integrity of the environment and God that created it will ensure that the treasure can be protected and passed on to succeeding generations. When we do it right, and we do it with nuance, and we do it with honor, introducing the lessons from faith traditions helps us, I think, to have better conversations. And there's a host of stuff, other stuff that really there isn't time to go into. But if you're interested, it is in the book that Ariel kindly mentioned. I put this up not for self-promotion, well, not entirely for self-promotion, but I do want to give, if you are interested in this version, it's a how-to book. It's what I found as a utilitarian, as a scientist, as a very practical person. What were the tools that I learned from this 8-year journey in how to have better conversations, starting within ourselves and moving on into larger and larger groups. Thanks very much.
Very enlightening, different angle that for some of us is something new. Even though I had the book, but I didn't understand fully.
No equations, I know.
So, any questions? Any questions?
Yeah. Yeah, also comments, yeah.
I was just going to ask if you've been in a situation where you've been mediating between a group of people and it just wasn't successful.
Oh, all the time.
And what you learned from that.
So have I been in a group where the process was not successful? Yes, and the best tool is to redefine success. I was in a lot of meetings, quote, blow up. And I've recognized that especially conversations around water take years, if not decades. So any little movement that we can make. But I was in a meeting, it was sponsored by, again, I won't say whom, because I'm cognizant of the camera here. But it was a meeting sponsored by somebody who just didn't like mediation. And so I was asked to come, and he basically just sat me, as a 3-day meeting, and sat me on the side for 2.5 days while everything just blew up, and they screamed at each other for 2.5 days. And at lunch on the 3rd day, he said, yeah, go do your stuff. And I said, okay, I'm going to take lunch to go find out what they would see as possible positive outcomes in our next couple of hours together. He said, no, don't do that. It'll make us look like we're unprepared. That's not a healthy process. But a lot of times, yeah, and I learn new things about boundaries and about what you can say and can't say, and yeah, absolutely. And you just keep going, because because that's part of it. It's like any relationship, right? There's ups and downs, and you hope that the general trajectory is upward. Yeah. You said you had a comment.
First, thank you so much for this alternative, from my point of view, perspective of looking at ways in which we might be able to resolve water-related conflict.
Yeah.
As an African, all of a sudden, putting the sum total of your presentation together, I have to go back to my culture. And what I see immediately, for example, is an antelope on the lower side of the stream and a lion on the upper stream. And the lion looking at the antelope and saying, talking to the antelope, why are you making it difficult for me to drink water? Mind you, the lion is at the source
Yeah.
and trying to start trouble with the antelope that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not the lion can drink water,
Yeah.
only as a way to start trouble. I use that example because many of your examples or cases that
Yeah.
came out of the presentation have binary components
Exactly.
to them.
Yes.
In that sense, the contemporary world, and for me contemporary means really the 1648 beginning of our state system, where the boundaries
Yeah.
have been drawn. And contemporary for me in the context of African countries is 1884, the Berlin Conference, where Europeans got together and drew those boundaries.
Yeah.
So if we put this together, I wonder the extent to which really the conflicts are truly between two people. Because if we take the Nile River conflict,
Yeah.
many people categorically would think that the Nile flows from Egypt to Ethiopia,
Yeah.
when it is flowing the other
That's
way.
right. Yeah.
And it's not just a conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia.
Yeah.
There is Britain, there is Israel, there is United States, all looking.
Yeah.
So what we see as an alternative dispute resolution is really fundamentally not about justice, but about maintaining the status quo in a way that allows peace to exist.
Yeah.
Because justice will really mean, as you were saying in the case of Jordan and Israel, recognition, and therefore doing something to ensure that what we now recognize is truly given to whoever owns it.
Yeah. 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 No, it's a powerful statement. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering, how involved are you with the parties after the mediation occurs? Do you check in and see the progress over the span of a few years, stuff like that?
Yeah, I try to. The question is how involved am I afterwards? And it depends on the process. Definitely the more powerful time to be involved is before. So if I have the time and the resources, that's what I'll try and do, is visit everybody to find out what they're looking for and to start to explore where there might be some overlap. And in between, especially if it's going to be one of these multi-year, multi-decadal processes, I do try. The water world's a really small world, and so you end up seeing people anyway, even if you're not actively looking for it. But it's an important point to stay connected. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a thought about, and I don't mean to take away from the talk, because I totally agree with a lot of what you said. One of the things that struck me, though, is that when you identify with somebody's religion, there is almost immediately an inherent trust that is developed. And I will use our current president, who, by all accounts, is not a Christian, never shown any interest in it, but proclaimed himself a Christian and immediately has the support of the Christian community behind him. So I just kept thinking when you were talking about this, how much of the cooperation you get is because you actually acknowledge and identify with the religious groups that are in the room,
Yeah.
versus it actually being empathetic or listening, or there just almost seems to be an inherent implied trust when you identify yourself as either a part of or
Yeah.
understanding their religion, or one of the things that struck me as you were talking there is there's almost
Yeah.
like to a detrimental extent they're trusting when they believe that you are on the same kind of spiritual
Yeah.
wavelength that they're on.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because usually people ask the opposite questions. Like, once you bring religion, aren't you bringing in all the divisiveness and the painful history of most faiths? And I think both are true. I think, like everything else, again, I approach this as a utilitarian. I was really interested in what I could use in my world from this world. And what I found, first of all, the deep distinction between religion and spirituality. And so you'll find all of us know people who are religious and not spiritual, and all of us know people who are spiritual and not religious. And I find in the spiritual tradition, there's deep inherent empathy and understanding across those boundaries. And so, and in the, quote, religious world, there are deep distinctions across the boundaries. I find in the Western world, once I started to do this in public, I found two reactions. One, I think there are a lot of people who are in the U.S. and in the West in general, who are either vaguely spiritual or deeply spiritual in a tradition, and are just tired of not talking about it. I mean, we're in a university where this is one of the motivating factors for so much of what we do, and we've lost the language for talking about it in a respectful, nuanced way. And so that's one reaction. It's like, yeah, of course. I mean, of course. You can't talk about water without talking about spirituality. And you can't talk about history without talking, or literature, or art, or so on and so on. So there's that reaction. And then there's the other reaction, which was my initial reaction also, is like, don't bring that into the room. It's divisive. As soon as you say, I am this, then you're not that. And that's the part that, and again, in my tradition, usually when somebody's talking to me about faith in America, they're trying to convince me that I'm doing something wrong and want me to do something different. So I'm cognizant of all of that. And what I guess I'm urging, certainly in a university environment, we got to learn to do this better. We have to learn to have these conversations better and remind ourselves how deeply powerful this is as motivation for so much of the world. And how useful it is, especially if we're talking about things like conflict and cooperation. And two, that there's, I mean, just from the rational side, there are so many good tools there. How do you sit when you're in conversation? How do you craft a conversation that starts at values? These are things that people have been doing for thousands of years. And if we're not tapping into that, we're just missing out on a wealth of possibilities.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Yeah.
Aaron.